Welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video, and I hate filming in busy public places. I'm back in Southwark today, another area that I covered in the very early days of the channel, but I don't really feel like I did it justice. It's an area also known as the Borough, or just Borough, and I did write a long rambling piece explaining why exactly that came about, but perhaps I'll bung that in another video. And for now, let's just focus on the pubs. Here I'll just say that it's an area which grew up around the southern entrance to London Bridge, where travellers arriving from places like Kent and Sussex would arrive in London. It was at one time dominated by ancient inns catering to the needs of those travellers, but today it's probably more famous for its market. We will, of course, get onto those ancient coaching inns, but it would be remiss to come to Borough without talking about the famous market and giving a tip of the hat to its most famous pub, which today is called the Market Porter. Cheers from the Market Porter. There has been a pub on this site for a surprisingly long time, almost certainly 250 years, so it's probably been here for the entire time that the market has been here at this location. Originally, Borough Market was a bit of a free-for-all, spreading out onto the high street, and the area was already congested enough, London Bridge infamously so. So it was felt something had to be done about it, and in 1756 Parliament passed the Borough Market Act, and following on from that, this space was given over to the market from then on. The Market Porter was until quite recently called the Harrow, and prior to that the Plough and Harrow, and the Harrow is a name that has been associated with this little street that it finds itself on the corner of, now known as Park Street, all the way back to the 17th century. For much of that history, it was Dead Man's Place, a reference to the burial ground for plague victims which stood nearby. On William Morgan's map of 1682, you can see Dead Man's Place, and it has a route that is remarkably unchanged compared to modern-day Park Street. At this end of Dead Man's Place, it was also known, perhaps colloquially to begin with, as Harrow Corner, and you can see evidence of that in the London Gazette in 1687. Henry Thrale, a friend of Samuel Johnson, was apparently born in an alehouse on Harrow Corner, according to his wife, Mrs. Thrale, in her book Thraliana, and it's tempting to think that that's referring to this pub, which would likely, at that time, if it existed, have been known as the Harrow. On John Rock's map of 1746, you can see Dead Man's Place marked again, and as noted previously, this end of it is called Harrow Corner. The first definitive record I found for the pub's existence comes from a Sunfire Office Insurance record from 1777. At that time, the pub was known as the Plough and Harrow. The address is given as Borough Market, and the victualler was one Robert Vaughan. So it could be the case that the pub was established sometime around then and simply took its name from the street it found itself on, Harrow Corner. Or it could be that Harrow Corner was actually named after the pub, which would suggest this pub has 17th century origins. By the time of Hallward's map of 1799, the whole of Dead Man's Place and Harrow Corner has been renamed to Park Street, again with a remarkably similar layout to how we see it today. The pub would have been this building here on the corner. When did the name change to the Market Porter? I've seen conflicting accounts online that suggest it was as early as the 1890s, but I think it's much more recent than that. At some point in the 19th century, the Plough in Plough and Harrow seems to have been dropped, and it became simply the Harrow. And it still had that name at least as far as this obituary in 1925. I couldn't find a lot of other mentions of it in the newspaper, either as the Harrow or the Plough and Harrow or as the Market Porter for much of the 20th century. And the earliest one I found was in 1981. By that time it was called the Market Porter, and it was reopening after a facelift. And there's even a mention there in the article that it was formerly known as the Harrow. So my guess would be, particularly given that there had been a facelift, it was renamed shortly before that. Let's take a quick look at the exterior. The building doesn't have much in the way of ornamentation that would be a giveaway for it being a Victorian pub building. So at first glance, it looks a little bit to me like a Georgian pub building. It has these trapezoid flat brick arches or lintels over the windows, which have been painted in white paint, possibly lightly stucco rendered. But other than that, none of the usual decoration around the windows that we're familiar with seeing in Victorian pubs. However, it does also remind me a little bit of the Burlington Arms in Savile Row, which we saw recently, and that dated to 1882. So this could be a building of a similar date, more or less the late Victorian period, but just one that was built to a relatively modest specification. Inside, I would say the pub feels reassuringly woody. I don't know how old any of these fixtures or fittings are. Did ask behind the bar, as always, if it was okay to take a few interior shots, and curiously they said anything but the bar counter. So that's probably while I'm babbling away here, I'm showing you some other bits of the interior of the pub, which hopefully give you a feel for it. It is actually, I think, a surprisingly nice pubby pub. Alas, not being able to take shots of the bar means that I can't show you the bar lineup either, but there were a decent showing of perhaps 6 or 7 real ales, including, happily for me, of course, Harvey's Sussex Best. It seems appropriate on a channel about pubs, which also occasionally touches on beer, to talk about the long history of the hop merchants of Borough Market, perhaps best exemplified by the hop and malt exchange, which you can't see behind me because it's currently covered in scaffolding. This was built in 1866, and if you could actually see it beyond the scaffolding there, would be a wonderful example of neoclassical Victorian architecture. It's a bit difficult to appreciate the building from the outside at the moment, so I'll skip the little bit of architectural commentary I was going to do, but I did manage to sneak inside and get a couple of interior shots, and it's really magnificent, a beautiful bit of 1860s architecture. Hopefully I'm showing you some of that on screen right now. The hop trade here in Borough goes back much further than the 1860s though, and you can see it depicted in this picture, which was a frontispiece to the 1729 book The Riches of a Hop Garden by Richard Bradley. That shows a scene of Borough High Street, with the market at that time sprawled all over the street. In the foreground you can see market traders selling meat, fruit and vegetables, and in the middle ground you can see these large sacks. Some of them are in the awning, the porch of a building that possibly was the old market hall at that time, possibly the old town hall, and they're also loaded onto wagons. Those sacks are all filled with hops. Borough became the national centre of the hop trade because of its location at the convergence of those routes, those ancient routes coming from areas like Kent, Sussex and Surrey, the traditional hop growing regions. Reports of the sales of hops at borough markets start to appear in the newspapers from the 18th century onwards, like this one from 1766, a year in which the extraordinary fine weather caused a harvest of hops not known for the past 3 decades in Farnham in Surrey. Later these turned into regular reports on the hop prices at Borough Market, such as this one in 1854. And you can see at that time that different prices are charged for hops coming from different regions. The most prized, it seems, at that time are from Mid and East Kent. Sussex slightly further down the list, and intriguingly, foreign hops were at that time considered the least desirable. A happier time, some would say. Goad's map of 1887 shows how the area was littered with hop warehouses at that time. Take, for example, Talbot Inn yard, no fewer than 5 hop warehouses, and you can even see the names of some of the individual merchants there, such as Ongley and Thornton and Hook and Graham. Just a couple of doors up from the George is the beautiful facade of an old building, the former offices of William Henry and Herbert LeMay, hop factors. It's actually in stucco, but it's coloured to look like red sandstone, and it has this lavish relief sculpture on the first floor depicting hop pickers somewhat incongruously in classical attire. Of course, the reality is that hop pickers were typically working class people, often from here in Southwark, who'd go down to Kent once a year for a working holiday, a tradition that survived well into the 20th century. So that brings us to Borough High Street, the main road leading to London Bridge, and an ancient one. It is effectively the convergence of 2 Roman roads, Stane Street leading to Chichester and Watling Street leading to Canterbury and the Kentish coast. From at least the medieval period, this road was lined with inns, and although only one of those survives in at least something like its original form, we can still see relics of many of the other now vanished inns in yards and alleyways and lanes along Borough High Street. Many of these are identified on William Morgan's map of 1682, and all of these numbers down the eastern side of the street identified inns at that time. And if we move forward to Horwood's map of 1799, all of the inns that still existed then are named in full. So let's take a walk down Borough High Street and see what we can find out about the now vanished inns of Southwark. Starting from the north, one of the first inns we encounter on Horwood's map is the Ship Inn, roughly opposite where Southwark Cathedral is now. At that time it was known as St Saviour's Church. Unlike most of the vanished inns we'll be looking at today, there really is no trace whatsoever of this one left. it would have been completely swept away by the railway development. Hopefully you can hear the train going overhead to illustrate that. In 1720, Strype, another London mapmaker, comments that higglers were its chief customers. That's a charming old term for hawkers or peddlers. An illustration of the Ship Inn dated to 1827 by John Chessel Buckler appears in the Inns of Old Southwark and their associations. It looks delightfully ramshackle, and at that point in time it didn't have long left. I assume it was demolished sometime around the building of London Bridge Station in 1836, which is coincidentally the oldest London terminus still to be in use today. Next, and happily, an old Southwark inn that still exists in some form, albeit a Victorian rebuild, the King's Head. Cheers from the King's Head. Look at that, more Harvey's Sussex Best. Things are going brilliantly today, very pleased with that. Let's pause for a moment before we get to the pub proper to appreciate the archway leading off from Borough High Street into King's Head Yard. I suspect this is contemporary with the late Victorian pub rebuild, given the use of pink granite in those columns there, probably some kind of Swedish coastal. Some lovely carving in the upper parts, and of course the name of the pub. The current building has a date of 1881 on it, but looks like a kind of mock Tudor to me. So it's an interesting early example of mock Tudor pub architecture. Most of that came between the two wars in the 20th century. There's a bust of what appears to be Henry VIII, which is very appropriate for a bit of mock Tudor architecture. And that also fits in with the story that this ancient inn was originally called the Pope's Head Inn. It's first mentioned with that name in 1534 by the Abbot of Waverley, which happens to be the same year as the Act of Supremacy. That, of course, being the point in history where England parted ways with the Catholic Church. Papal references fell rather dramatically out of fashion after that, and the landlord at the time made the somewhat pragmatic decision to rename the pub from the Pope's Head to the King's Head. That would of course have been under the reign of Henry VIII, so that bust that we now see on the exterior feels again somewhat appropriate. Inside, it has a surprising locals boozer sort of feel to it, and what an absolute gem of a pub. It has carpet and knickknacks and signs on the wall of the ilk of "you don't have to be mad to work here, but it helps." The stained glass is quite impressive, but presumably much newer than that 1881 rebuild. In one corner is a nice painted and possibly etched mirror, which you can't really see very easily, but has a date under that notice that's been put on it of March 1978. And I suspect that the stained glass in the front windows is possibly of a similar era. I think it might actually be an independent pub today. It certainly doesn't have any obvious chain pub branding, and it gets a mention in CAMRA's Good Beer Guide. As possibly already noted, I'm having a pint of Harvey's Sussex Best, an absolute bargain for this area. This came in at £5.50, unheard of for a tourist hotspot like Borough. There were a total of 4 hand pumps, 2 pairs in different sides of the bar. Here is a quick look at those. Of course, I went for the Harvey's Sussex Best. Perhaps I could do the talking about the next sadly vanished coaching inn, the Hart Inn, while I'm sat here in comfort outside the King's Head enjoying my pint of Harvey's Sussex Best. There is, alas, no remnant whatsoever of the Hart Inn today, other than a plaque and the yard which takes its name from it, White Hart Yard, and that actually links up round the back with King's Head Yard. The White Hart probably dated back to the time of Richard II. It is a heraldic device that's often associated with him. He lived from 1367 to 1400. The White Hart gets a mention in Shakespeare's play Henry VI, which I believe he wrote in 1591, and that recounts some of the events of Jack Cade's rebellion in 1450. Will you needs be hanged with your pardons around your necks? Hath my sword therefore broke through London gates that you should leave me at the White Hart in Southwark? And it also gets a mention in Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers of 1836 to 1837. Here's the White Hart in 1858 as featured in the book The Inns and Taverns of Pickwick. And there is a later sketch in Walter Thornbury's book Old and New London, which was first published in 1873. The White Hart was still just hanging on at the time of Gode's map of 1887, but alas, a couple of years later it was demolished in 1889, and it gets quite a lengthy obituary in the Pall Mall Gazette. Next, and of course it's the one Southwark Inn that still survives today in something like its original form, it's the George. Cheers from the George Inn. Much has already been said about this pub, often cited as London's last surviving galleried coaching inn. The galleries there referring to these balconies, which were a common trait of these buildings at that time, albeit a rebuild of 1676, necessitated by the Great Fire of Southwark, a cruel twist of fate, given that Southwark had escaped the Great Fire of London just a decade earlier. I could talk about the Shakespearean and Dickensian connections, but that has been so well covered elsewhere. In fact, whole books have been written about the George Inn, most notably Pete Brown's excellent book, Shakespeare's Local. Perhaps what interests me most on this visit, in the context of talking about all those other ancient inns of Southwark that perished, is how this one managed to survive. London Bridge Station opened in 1836, and that of course signalled the beginning of the end of the era of the coaching inn. A decade later, in 1846, the London to Brighton train was advertised as taking just 2 hours. A coach at that time would have taken at least 7. However, the coaching inns didn't disappear overnight, and there was a period in which they had some amount of cooperation with the railway companies. As reported in Pete Brown's book in 1850, the Great Northern Railway Company had set up a network of receiving houses using old coaching inns to take in goods that would then further be transported by rail. This eventually led to the site of the George Inn being bought by the Great Northern Railway Company in 1874. On Gode's map of 1887, you can see that the northern part of the site was in use by the Great Northern Railway Company as a goods depot, and also other parts of the site were being used for offices. A roughly contemporary photo, this is from 1889, illustrates this. The pub is still lingering on in the parts of the site over to the left-hand side of the image, but everything from the middle to the right-hand side would have been occupied by the Great Northern Railway Company's offices and depot. Around the same time that the Great Northern Railway Company took over ownership of the site, Amelia Murray and her daughter Agnes took on the running of the George Inn, and they would be at the helm between the two of them right up until the 1930s. You can see Agnes depicted here in what I assume is an early 20th century postcard posing outside the front of the pub, also with her pet parrot. Towards the late 19th century, with all the other coaching inns having vanished, a definite sense of nostalgia started to emerge. Here's an example, an article from 1899, wherein all the Shakespearean and Chaucerian connections with the inns of Southwark are highlighted. That sense of nostalgia only grew in the ensuing decades, helped by the fact that the two Murray ladies had kept the pub remarkably unchanged. The ownership of the site remained in the hands of the Great Northern Railway, which eventually became the LNER throughout the time that Amelia and Agnes ran the pub. As Pete Brown suggests in his book, you can just about imagine that the railway company had some sense of responsibility for preserving this relic, having been the catalyst for the decline of the coaching inns a century earlier. In 1937, when LNER realised that the building was in danger of collapse and needed an owner who would take care of it better than they could, they gave it to the National Trust. The National Trust in turn went to Flowers Brewery, who had a reputation at that time for preserving and restoring historic pubs, and it became a listed building in 1950. Flowers were bought by Whitbread in the 1960s, and then, due to a series of subsequent mergers and acquisitions, it eventually became a Green King pub, and they still operate it today. Let's do a quick run through of the interior. It does make it onto CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. The bar named as the Parliament Bar, which is the first room on the right, has, as they say, remarkable old woodwork, and some of it might even be late 17th century, so contemporary, possibly with that 1676 rebuild. It has 2 fireplaces, and that potentially indicates that this was initially 2 distinct rooms. The part of that interior space closest to Borough High Street has full height horizontal boarding and simple fixed seating. There is also a notable clock that just has a single hand. At the other end of what is now that opened up room, there is a servery that has glazing around it. And if you look through that, the staff were very kind to let me go into that servery area. You can see a set of Victorian hand pumps, really quite rare. They were apparently still in use as recently as the 1970s, and you can see the maker's name, South Blackfriars Road. That room, I think the Parliament Bar is definitely the one with the most atmosphere. As you go further away from Borough High Street, the subsequent rooms feel a little bit more modern. Here is a look at, for example, the area around the bar counter, and then down the far end is a room that feels a little bit more given over to dining and feels a little bit more modern, but certainly the one with the most atmosphere is the one they now call the Parliament Bar, and that has some potentially quite ancient woodwork in it. The staircases are also potentially quite significant. They're called out in both cameras listing for the interior and the Historic England listing for the building. And there are further upstairs rooms as well. Again, I think today perhaps more given over to dining. Today, as noted, it is operated by Greene King, still owned by the National Trust. Here is a look at what was on the bar lineup. I went for a pint of Timothy Taylor's Landlord. Next, and arguably the most famous of Southwark's vanished inns, originally known as the Tabard and later known as the Talbot. Once again, it's remembered as a yard, today known as Talbot Yard, but the Victorian rebuild of the pub still survives, alas no longer running as a pub, on the corner of Talbot Yard. Today, I think it is a convenience store. This was built after the old building was demolished in 1873. It's a curious bit of Victorian Gothic architecture. The Tabard, as it was originally known, is famous for being mentioned in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And yes, I am going to do a few lines of Chaucer here. Why that assembled was this company in Southwark at this genteel hostelry that hight the Tabard fast by the bell, but now is time for you to tell. Apparently height there is Middle English for is called, and fast by the bell refers to the fact that it was close to the bell of what we now know as Southwark Cathedral, but at that time would have been St Saviour's Church. Like the George, the original building, as Chaucer would have known it, was destroyed at the time of the Great Fire of Southwark in 1676. It was rebuilt soon after that, and it was apparently at this time that the name changed from Tabard to Talbot. It's not really clear why this happened, whereas a tabard is an item of clothing, it's effectively a sort of sleeveless coat. A Talbot is a hunting dog, a breed apparently now extinct. The two things do sound somewhat similar, but other than that, they have nothing in common. We do have a few pictures of what the Tabard was like. This one, a drawing from 1780, and this one just before it was pulled down in the 1870s. That Victorian rebuild or replacement in the 1870s, if you can call it a replacement because it occupied such a tiny fraction of the original site, ceased to be a pub in, I think, around 1962, when at that time it was converted into a shop and accommodation, as attested to by this letter to a newspaper in that year. There's so many more of these now vanished Southwark coaching inns that I could talk about, but I'm not sure that many people have a huge appetite for talk of dead pubs, so I'll just focus on one more. There is a Queen's Head Yard today, but another sign there seems to suggest this has the alternative name of Warning Haschem, which is not particularly inviting. The book referenced earlier, The Inns of Southwark and Their Associations, suggests that the earliest mention of this pub is in 1587 as the Queen's Head, but prior to that it had been known as the Cross Keys. There's also a suggestion that, similar to the King's Head being renamed from the Pope's Head, as we saw earlier, this may also have been renamed as a result of the Reformation. In 1895, there were reports in the newspapers of the imminent demise of the Queen's Head, particularly lamentable as there were suggestions that it actually survived the Great Fire of Southwark in 1676. Next, and a bit of a change of scenery from those ancient coaching inns, a rather beautiful, I think, example of early 20th century pub design. This is the Lord Clyde. Cheers from the Lord Clyde, and look at that draft bass, what a treat. I have to admit this was a bit of a last-minute addition to the itinerary, but it does get plaudits from camera for its interior, and it's also a listed building. Historic England have gone to great lengths to describe both the building and its interior, and it seemed it would be very remiss of me to come to Borough/Southwark today and not give this place a bit of a look. So let's take a little bit of a run through of the exterior first. You can't fail to notice that this is a one-time Truman's pub, and we've seen similar designs to this at other pubs in previous videos, but this is a particularly interesting example because it's actually pre-war. Most of those Truman's rebuilds were interwar. This is just prior to the eve of World War I. The entirety of the ground floor has these green and in places cream glazed tiles. Along the side where I'm sitting now, we can see Truman's Burton Ales, the Lord Clyde, Truman's London Stout, advertising 2 of Truman's beers plus the name of the pub. On the corner, it also has the name of the landlord at the time of the rebuild. That was one E.J. Bayling, and we can still see his name there. Above that is the familiar panel that you get on a lot of these Truman's pubs with the famous eagle logo for the brewery. One of my favourite features of this exterior, which I'm partly obscuring with my head right now, has to be this œil de boeuf, I think it's called, window, this round window. It's a French term, obviously. I think it means something like the eye of the bull, and that has more of that green glazed ceramic ornamentation around it. There's etched glass today in all of the windows. That's not mentioned in the Historic England listing, so I wonder if that might have been a more recent replacement. 2 entrances to the pub, one marked saloon bar, the other marked public bar. Inside, what an absolute gem of a pub. As described by camera on their list of historic interiors, the main bar has a tapering matchboard counter, and there are also apparently doors within that for servicing the beer engines. That style to me looks very interwar. I'm used to seeing similar bar counters from, say, the 1930s, but I think that could potentially be original from that 1913 rebuild, in which case it would be a remarkably early example of that style. The bar back also quite attractive, including the pub's name on 2 sides in gold lettering. In one corner of that main bar room is a price list showing what Truman's were charging for their beers in 1961. That's a fascinating snapshot of the drinks that were on offer on draft at that point in history. There is a mild, a bitter, a best bitter, a keg bitter with a different price, and a strong ale. Bitter was priced at 1 and 10. Keg bitter actually priced higher at 2 and 4. Doesn't make any sense to me. There's also a particularly appealing mirror at the other corner of that bar room, advertising mild ales and double stout. As noted, this was a last-minute addition to today's itinerary, so I didn't really do much research on the history of this pub. It is named for Field Marshal Colin Campbell, 1st Baron Clyde, who was involved in a range of military campaigns in the 19th century, from the Peninsular War up to the Crimean War. And apparently the first incarnation of this pub was built in 1863, just after he died. This very much today has the feel of an independent pub. Very nice warm welcome from the staff behind the bar. And here is a look at what was on the bar lineup. Some quite appealing choices there. As noted, I went for a pint of draft Bass. This is in particularly good condition here. Again, an absolute gem of a pub. Final pub for today then, and any long-term viewers of the channel won't be surprised. I can't come to Borough without paying my respects at the Royal Oak, or as I like to call it, the Sussex Embassy. One of only 2 or 3, is it, pubs in London ran by Harvey's Brewery, my favourite brewery of all time. I've featured this pub in several videos before, but I've only ever talked about the beer because I absolutely bloody love it. And I've never really talked about the pub itself, and I thought this might be a good opportunity to do just that. I'd always assumed this to be just a Victorian pub, but I think a pub on this site with this name actually goes back significantly further than that. At the time of Hallward's map of 1799, what we now know as Tabard Street was at that time called Kent Street, and was in fact part of the Old Kent Road as we know it today, that ancient route leading from London down to Canterbury and the Kentish coast. If we zoom in a bit on Kent Street, we can actually see a Royal Oak Court, and there are Sunfire Office insurance records that suggest that there was a pub here at that time called the Royal Oak. Kent Street was renamed to Tabard Street in 1877, and there is a suggestion that the motivation for that was, at least in part, to try and turn a page on its previously impoverished and at times quite troubled history. It actually gets a mention all the way back in 1665 in Samuel Pepys' diary. A miserable, wretched, poor place, people sitting sick and muffled up with plasters at every 4 or 5 doors. And it seems well into the 19th century it had struggled to shake that image. I couldn't find many accounts of the pub's history over the course of the 19th and 20th century, but there is this one report from 1899 of the landlord at that time being convicted for fraud, along with, I think, his older brother. They obtained £120 of cigars and £16, which apparently at that time bought you 9 dozen bottles of whiskey, under false pretences. I was amused by the note thrown in somewhat casually at the end that neither of the accused parties had any prior criminal record, other than that the elder of the two had been convicted of bigamy. I believe it was in 1997 that Harvey's took over the pub, it having previously been a Courage pub. Harvey's did a refurbishment at that time, and I think possibly some of these Victorian style fittings on the interior may actually date from that era rather than being genuinely old. But it has won some plaudits from the likes of Camera, who put it on their list of outstanding conversions and renovations. Here's what they have to say about the pub. It's a Victorian corner pub, carefully restored by Harvey's to how it might have been in the 1850s. 2 bare-boarded bars are separated by what used to be an off-sales area. The partitions have good quality glass and there are mahogany bar fittings. Prints and old photographs adorn the traditional interior. A delightful pub. That seems to be an allusion to the fact that the pub building may date to 1850. To my eyes, it looks a bit more late Victorian than that, possibly 1880s or thereabouts. I found a couple of old photos of the pub. Alas, I'm not sure I can actually show them on screen, but one from the early 90s seems to confirm that the tiling on the exterior is somewhat older than the Harvey's takeover of the pub. I suspect that's probably interwar. And a photo from the London Picture Archive, again regrettably I can't show you it for copyright reasons, shows that it was a Courage pub at that time. But what can be seen of the upper floors look pretty similar to how it looks today, albeit the ground floor frontage appears to be a bit different. Of course, the main draw for me at the Royal Oak has always been the beer. I think it would still be a great pub even if it wasn't a Harvey's pub, but they do have a spectacular selection of Harvey's ales, not just good old Stalwart, my favourite beer of all time, Harvey's Sussex Best, but they have the Old Ale, the Mild, Sisters, I think that comes from Seven Sisters potentially, is a sort of lighter version of Harvey's Sussex Best, and they have some of the seasonal and special beers that they put on from time to time as well. A bit later in the year they'll probably have Bonfire Boy when it comes up to bonfire time in Lewes. So this is, for me, a little piece of Sussex transplanted to here in Southwark. That is going to be it for today from Borough and or Southwark. As noted, I have made a video about how it got those 2 distinct names, if you're interested in that sort of thing. It's been a particularly good run, I thought. I've had good beers that I wanted to drink in every single pub, and of course this place, the Royal Oak, has provided me with some absolutely exemplary beer from good old Harvey's. So I shall bid you adieu at that point. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.